Edit that out.
Right, this is Geoff Spencer. He's been a party member in Stockport, an official of the party and the NUT for that matter for donkey's years. But Geoff is going to talk to us about a number of things. He's going to start off with a thing about premises that the party used to own. So over to you, Geoff.
Okay, the premises, it's a fairly long story, but I'll cut it fairly sharp. The first premises that the Labour Party had, they bought, I think, in 1926, and they left in 1941. And it was a central hall, and it was on Hillgate. I understand that it was a former church that they bought, but there is one person I know, and she has delivered leaflets for us in Edgeley Ward for some time, but she's unable to do now because of illness. It's Hilary Gaskell, and she remembers as a child being taken by her granddad to the central hall, and she saw Ramsay MacDonald. Now that of course is a significant thing. This is a fellow who had been a Labour Prime Minister, and he was visiting Stockport, and this lady saw him. The next premises that we bought or rented, and it cost us, I believe from the information I have, £40 a year for the rent, and that was at 117 Wellington Road South, facing Stockport College, and we went there from 1943 to 1952, and that was the first time we had a full-time agent. That was Alan Mason, and he ran the party from there. In 1952 we bought the Adelphi Hall, and we were there until something like 68, sorry. And this was a significant purchase on our behalf. It was made possible by Harry Ponsonby donating, initially he put it up as a loan of £5,000 so that the hall could be bought. Members who were in the building trade, which I had a background in, worked on the premises, which needed a lot of work doing, and there was a great deal of effort put in to turn it into a place that could be used and enjoyed by members for many, many years. When the time came to repay the loans, Harry Ponsonby and his wife decided to turn it into a donation. And it was down to Harry Ponsonby, really, that we are where we are now with business and places, which are down to Harry Ponsonby's efforts initially to launch us on the property business. It was opened by Jim Griffiths, and there is in fact a programme that I've made available for Peter to study. It was opened by Jim Griffiths, and there was a great attendance there, and it served the purpose of bringing the party members together. It was bang in the centre of the Stockport. It was near to the town hall where councillors were, and on Saturday mornings, for example, there was a coffee morning. Members going into Stockport to shop would call in there, or coming out from shopping would call in there. The MPs would be there as the turn came round. Councillors would be there. Ernie Brunett from the Express would be there, keeping his ears and eyes open. And John Holland was there, always. So members were able to talk to councillors.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Geoff. Who was Jim Griffiths? Who was John Holland? And who was Harry Ponsonby? Harry Ponsonby had a building named after him at the town hall, didn't it? It had just been demolished.
I'll come to Harry Ponsonby later.
Yeah, okay.
You can edit that bit out, but I'll come to that as a member. We left there because maintaining the place became difficult. It was an old building, and we moved for a short period to the AEU office on Wellington Road South, and that also was facing the college. I'm not sure of the date that we left, but our next place where we invested money, the holdings, £10,000 eventually, into a disaster. And this was the premises, the old advertiser premises, which were bought with the purpose of providing a trade union centre, and the Labour Party would be involved with it as well. It would cater for young people who were leaving school not able to get a job, and there would be a training session available for them. There'd be a bar, printing there. The Labour Party took a lease on one floor, which was useful and very helpful, and they gave us a 99-year lease, which was interesting. It didn't last 99 months really, it didn't, because it went bust. It was being run by people who didn't know what they were doing. And the most disconcerting factor to emerge from that, they'd taken loans out with the brewery and a bank, and they got their money back for when it finished. They actually sold the premises on again. And there was not a single trade union who put a single penny up for what was a trade union centre. The only money that had come from outside the banks and the other people lending money was in fact the Labour Party, and we lost 10,000 quid on it. The next move we made from there, it became rather complicated. We didn't have any premises to depend on, and we tended to move around, and ultimately we came in, I think it was 1987, when we bought the club, and we also bought the land on which it stands, so that the Labour Party now owns the building and the land on which it stands, and you know, it's there for the future of the Labour Party to do with as it wishes. We did have an investment property, and it's rather a long story of not going into how we came to have it, which had value, which we sold eventually to buy the club, and we also had an income of £6,000 a year from those premises. So the premises were something that a lot of people rather got upset about, because things had not worked out as they should, but that's the way of things. Some people get blamed for it, some don't. Now I'd like to look at the people.
Right, Geoff, I think you're now wanting to talk about people that you remember from all those years back.
Yes, well, these were people who were members of the council for many years before we started winning seats after the war, and finally taking control in 1955.
Okay.
Right, the people I wish to draw attention to. First one is Harry Ponsonby. Harry was a leather merchant with a shop on Shore Heath. He was first elected to the council in 1920, and he became an alderman in 1945. He was a stalwart of the Labour Party. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party before a time that the Labour Party sorted itself out. He was the first leader of the Labour group when we took control, but he soon passed that on to John Holland, who I shall refer to shortly. He was the chair of the Health Committee, and this was an interest that he clearly had, because he was in the chair of that committee for many years. And sadly, at a meeting at the town hall, he collapsed and died. By the time they got him over to the infirmary, he was in fact dead. And Ponsonby House, which this Liberal crowd have knocked down and are building it with Fred Perry's name, they still ought to call it Ponsonby House, I think. Ponsonby House was named after Harry Ponsonby, and as I mentioned earlier, he put up £5,000 for us to buy the Adelphi, and he will be long remembered and well missed. The other one I wish to draw attention to was John Holland. And John Holland was the manager at Portwood Spinning Mill, very large outfit. He was a JP, as Harry Ponsonby was, and he was first elected in 1925, and he became an alderman in 1952. He did in fact become leader of the group. He was chairman of Finance Committee and also leader of the group. So he was the one who had his hand on what went on in the Labour group as they ran the town. I became his, I don't know whether you call him a PR or whatever, you know, there are loads of them in London now. And what I did, I operated with him at making sure that he was covered by the press, and I wrote up stuff to go in the press for him. But I also became his hitman. Now that's a bit of unusual. We had a councillor called Eric Lawson. I'm not sure which ward he represented at that time. He did it at one time represent the Portwood ward. And Eric had been rather careless in having talked to the press. And in his discussion with them, he criticised the Labour group and the policies it was pursuing. And this, of course, landed him in all sorts of trouble. And I was given a letter by John Holland to take to Eric, and he had to sign it. And it was a letter of his resignation on which there was no date. And I was sent off to Northgate Road. So Eric, Geoff, come in. Right, I've got a letter here for you to sign, Eric. Read it. And his initial response, no, I'm not signing that. I was misquoted by the press. And I said, well, I've taken the trouble to talk to the reporter who you gave the interview to, and it was on the record. And he said that any politician should know it's on the record when the reporter is writing down what you say. And I said, you've got a choice now, Eric. There's no date on that letter, but if you don't sign it, you will in fact be excluded from the Labour Party group, and I'm reasonably sure you'll be thrown out of the Labour Party as well. So here's a pen, get it signed. And he did. And he behaved himself from that time onwards, because the threat that was made to him, if he misbehaved again, he would be thrown out. Another man of some importance, I thought, although he wasn't one of the great leaders of the group and things like that, was Arthur Fowkes. And he was a railway man, and as I understand, he was a wheel tapper. And he lived in the area that I lived in. He was a councillor for Hollywood Ward, and he was elected in 1929, and he became an alderman in 1952. He used to take his dog for a walk every Sunday down Gauzy Bank, an estate which wasn't noted for its voting records. And it was interesting, when we went canvassing on election night down in Gauzy Bank, Arthur would go along, knocking on a door, and he didn't say, will you vote or have you voted? He said, come on, you've not voted yet. And it was rather like the Pied Piper. As he went along, they were coming out and going up. I think it possibly helped in some houses because he was a JP as well. Now, one thing where he was badly treated, his big interest had been, he was chairman of the Sewage Outflow Committee, because that was a big thing to Cheadle Heath. And he was also chairman of the Waterworks Committee. This is in the County Borough days. And Dick Burns told me of this happening when it became, under the Tory government, a water board. Stockport, which had its own reservoir, the Goit Reservoir, was overwhelmed by people from outside of the area, Cheshire, tourists from as far away as Wilmslow became, and the first meeting that was held in this room was to elect a new chairman, and Arthur was in the chair, and the first item of business, select a chairman, and the Tories voted solidly and threw him out. And he smoked a pipe, did Arthur, and the door in the room was along the long side of the room, halfway along, and according to Dick Burns, he walked out, got to the door and turned on this lot, throwing a pipe in the air and said, "You haven't got a bucket of water between you." It's fairly summed up. But that was the end of Arthur as a waterworks. He was in fact a really dedicated member of the Labour Party. He's a sort of fellow who you could have nailed to the wall, I think, for all his views, and that says a lot about him. Russell Fox was a Reddish councillor, and he was elected in 1929. I'm not sure when he became an alderman. But it is interesting that in those days, Reddish seemed to consider itself as separate from Stockport. They seemed to have a greater affinity with Manchester. For example, at the election, instead of coming into Stockport, where everybody celebrated or moaned that they were all lost, they did their own bit in Reddish. But he was in fact a very able, and he was at one stage chairman of the Education Committee when we were in power. The other one that I want to refer to, Russell Fox, by the way, was a postmaster. Charlie Cooper was a cotton merchant, and he was a councillor for Reddish, and he was elected in 1938, and he became an alderman. Now, he was the moving factor in getting the Nook built. He was the man, I gather, who was the brains behind it and pulled everyone together, and through this he was in fact prosecuted and convicted because he had broken the building materials regulations which were set up by the then Labour government, which meant that you could not get building materials unless you had a licence to do it, and he didn't, and he finished up in court and he was convicted. You could go on, so many of the people, I think then councillors, many of the candidates were characters. Today I think councillors tend to be professional. It's a different job now that councillors face and do compared with what councillors did all those years ago.
I started off. Now, Geoff, you told me you wanted to talk about when Labour took control in 1955.
Yeah, we've been picking up seats from 1945, 46, bit by bit, and we only turfed the Tories out with the aldermanic elections in 1955. Some people may not know what I'm talking about when we talk of aldermanic elections, but aldermen were elected by councillors for 5 years, and there was one for each ward. That meant there were 18 aldermen, and they didn't come out at the same time as councillors. Not to be said for it, it meant councillors couldn't be overturned where all the seats are up for grabs and a party can lose control completely. It had to be a gradual business of getting it out. The Tories were in charge of Stockport for 50 years, from 1903, when they turned the Liberals out, who had been investigated for malpractice and found responsible for it it tells us a story that's about the Liberals. They were doing dirty tricks then. And it was corruption that really was at the bottom of what they'd been up to when the Tories got in 1904. We ran Stockport, and this put things into perspective, for 14 years until 1969. And in that time we did a great deal. We got rid of the slums and we built new estates. Cyril Orford, who was the chairman of the welfare committee, was told that he would be given money for each year until he built old people's homes, of which there were none when we took over, until we felt that there was enough to meet the needs of Stockport's old people, and that number was 6. And he had money to start those until we'd reached the 6, and that was one of the things we left behind for the tourists to pick up when we lost. The first decision they took was to change all the meetings from the day to night, because a lot of Labour Party members couldn't stand for election, simply because it was difficult to get time off work. Not all employers were good employers in this sense, and all the meetings were changed. There were monthly meetings. We don't have this now from a lot. Well, I don't think they have meetings now, do they? There were, in fact, let me just look what I'm saying. Let me just go back a second. In 1955, we had 11 aldermen, 32 councillors, which gave us 43 seats. The Tories had 7 aldermen and 29 councillors that gave them 36. And we had a majority of 7. And that meant we had to staff every subcommittee with a majority. We also had to have the chair and the vice chair of each committee. And I'm pretty certain, I think the number of committees was 29. There were 29 subcommittees. And it's incredible that this was local government in those days. Subcommittees, and they all had 12, or most of them did. Education had more. 12. And of those, 7 had to be Labour members. So it meant that some councillors had to double up on not only one subcommittee, but others, because there was not enough to go round and run it as they did. And this is why, of course, they were able to do it at night. I mentioned the fact that we demolished the slums, and that's a great achievement, because the only thing the Tories had left when they were thrown out was that they'd put a road over the River Mersey, which now underpins Mersey. And one of the things that when I was writing things up for John Holland for the press was to use the phrase, we're providing progress at the right price. And one of the other things he used to say was, I'm a ratepayer as well. And I think this, and I thought it was interesting some years ago to find the Liberals had dug this up, and they used progress at the right price to charge them for it. So the next thing, we can come back to that in many ways, but I'd like to refer now to Nye Bevan. And he spoke in Stockport at the town hall at the 1950 election. And the building, the room was absolutely packed, and there was a fairly large overflow meeting in Exchange Street at the back. And he kicked off, and the young Tories had monopolised the front row of the balcony. Now, a lot of people will not know that there was a balcony there. I've talked to people and they say, where is the balcony? There's a balcony right at the top. And there was about 6 rows of seats in depth. And the Tories had filled the front row, and they draped over the front of the balcony, "Follow America." Now this was a campaign being run by the Daily Express, that Britain should follow America. And of course Bevan gets going, and he stammered badly. A lot of people may not know this, but he stammered very badly. And this lot started heckling him, "Follow America." And he let me go on for a while, and then he said, listen to them, listen to them, follow America. When we left Dunkirk, we led the world. Bloody place erupted. And it had calmed down, and then he went in for the coup d'etat. And he said, "Britons were not born to follow. Britons were born to lead." Bumped in the air. Yeah. And the people at the back of the balcony started throwing the weight about, that they were glad to get out of the way of the young Tories, and somebody screwed up the banner they got and threw it over onto the seats below. Now then, one of the things that happened then was that the League of Youth, which I was in then, tended to be at the back of the stage, and there was in fact a policeman there, because it was a cabinet minister, and a shoebox which was taped over was handed in, and the policeman said, "Well, we've got to open that." And when it was opened, there was a dead rat in it. Now this really related to what Nye had said at the 1948 at Bellevue. There's an annual meeting each year in July, a rally at Bellevue, and he was a speaker. And the following day, he declared open the NHS at the hospital in Trafford. And of course he was talking about the NHS quite a lot in his speech. And he said, "I've been asked how I managed to get the consultants to sign up and agree to it, because they'd opposed it." And he said, "I stuffed their mouths with gold." And then of course he went on to talk about the way in which some employers refused to accept that workers died from industrial illnesses. And then he went on to say that as a young miner, his father had died in his arms from pneumoconiosis. And then he went on to say, "The Tory leopard will never change its spots. They're lower than vermin." And that's where that came from. And he's never been reported properly. Some time ago, there was a report in The Guardian about him saying this, but they didn't have the context in which it was said. And I rang the editor up at The Guardian, who deals with people who wish to talk to somebody, and they said, "Well, can't do anything. We can only use what's in our archives." So it was not cut. So that was 9. And the next thing I want to mention is our campaigns were rather different than they are now with councillors. And there were some of us in the League of Youth who were going to Alan Mason. Alan Mason had a car. In those days, to have a car was the exception. Very few people had. And we were going to Lyme Park. There was a weekend conference on. And when he stopped at the Blossoms at the lights, the horse trough, which was at the end of Hillgate, where its junction with Wellington Road was there, and the Labour candidate for St Thomas's was stood in the horse trough with quite a lot of people around him. So we all got out to see what he was. His name was Len Young. He was an engineer, he was a turner at Arundel's. And he had a stiff brush, and his trousers were rolled up above his knees, and he's sweeping all the stuff out in the horse trough and saying, "This Tory council It's terrible the way they treat animals. Does he know the way they treat animals? And there was about 14 people watching him. So, you know, with the best will in the world, you know, somebody can't see Sheila Bailey pulling off a stunt like that. Even if she wanted to, I don't think she could. Anyway, that's unusual happening. Not many people got their trousers up, and, you know, got into horse straps. He was the only one as far as I know. But it was different. The next one I want to refer to is stolen votes. Now this actually happened. In those days, the counting of local elections took place in schools, and there were two wards in each school, two which were adjacent to each other. When Edgeley was linked with Shaw Heath at Alexandra Park School, and at the end, Edgeley had finished its count. The result had been declared, but at Shaw Heath there appeared to be a problem. The number of votes that were standing there in the hundreds, and they're telling you, there were 100 votes were missing from those which were emptied from the boxes earlier on. There were 100 votes missing before he could declare the result. And the policeman was called. There was always a policeman on duty in those days. The policeman was called, and he said, well, I'm going to lock the door and nobody must leave, and I'll have a look round to see if I can find them. And of course people were looking all over the shore, through the hall, behind the pipes, under cupboards, on top of cupboards. And of course we didn't know who the votes belonged to. And the Tory candidate was in fact Tom Sides, and his wife, she was there, she was a teacher, and she decided to really up the ante. She strolled up to the returning officer, threw her out and said, I want you to strip me, I want you to check me to see if I've got any of these votes on me. We've nothing to fear. I want you to in fact do that. And of course everybody's starting arguing then, and the copper comes back and says, I've found them. And they were saturated, and he was squeezing water out of them as he came in, and he gave them to the returning officer. He said, I found those in a system in a toilet. And of course the question was, whose votes were they? And they were Labour votes. So one of the Tories, were no Liberals there then, one of the Tories had, how they'd managed it, they slipped 100 votes into a system, and the conclusion of that was that an offence had been committed, and the returning officer said, I can take this no further, but everyone who is here, their name and address is known to the town clerk, and I shall be passing this on when I return to the town hall to put the results of these elections in. And it will be up to him to decide what action to take. But clearly an offence has been committed and someone is guilty of it. And of course what happened? Nothing. But the Tories had tried to pinch 100 votes, and we got in.
Just hang on a moment, okay, far away. Okay.
Right, this is a leaflet that cost the party a bob or two. We were sued for the leaflet. It was 1951, it was Hollywood Ward, and the candidate was Charlie Doughty, who was a trade union official, and the Tories had actually produced a leaflet which showed the leaflet that Charlie had used before the war when he stood as a communist candidate somewhere in Stockport, and they'd used that against him. And we all went out canvassing. Alan Mason was there, and when we came back, the Maurice Watson, who was he was an exceptional councillor and alderman. He was an intellect that served us well. He visited the committee rooms and he'd written a reply. Everybody read it, said, oh yeah, we'll do this. Alan Mason said, we'll do it. The only one person said no, and that was Arthur Fowkes, and he said it's personal, we shouldn't do it. We did it, 1,000 were printed. I went with Alan to Wellington Road, where we printed it on, you know, whatever it was, machine they had in those days. And there was 1,000 printed, and the next day I delivered it with some youngsters. At the count, we were told by the Tory candidate, who Brown, his name was, that he was going to sue us. And what the leaflet had said was that Councillor Brown runs a firm that sells motor cars, and at the Watch Committee meeting, whose meetings he seldom misses, an item on the agenda was to buy 2 new police cars, and he in fact left the meeting because of a possible interest problem with him. And when he was out, the Tories there decided the only cars we can have are Wolseley's. And they ordered 2 Wolseley's at £900 each. And who was the person who sold the Wolseley's? Councillor Brown. It then went on to say that last year you defeated his executive secretary, and he should do the same with him this year. Now, he didn't complain about the comment about his executive secretary, and there was good reason for that. It was not his wife, it was somebody else's. But he did complain about what was said about him by the cars. And the thing that really struck home was the statement at the end, vote Labour for clean politics. And we got the writ, and Alan Mason and the party officers, there were people who had not been involved in it, which were involved in the apology. And they decided to see Leslie Lever, who was a Labour MP and a solicitor. He got a brother who was a Labour MP in Manchester as well, and he was a millionaire. And Leslie Lever, it was near dinner time, said, well, you shouldn't have written it. And Alan Mason said, well, it's true. It doesn't matter, you shouldn't have written it. And at that moment, the cleaner came in and said, I need to clean Mr. Lever. So he said, right, we'll all go now. And they got into Albert Square, and he got a taxi, and they all bumped into this taxi, and it went on. And Alan Mason said, I've had enough of this. Stop this taxi, we're getting out. And they were sued, and damages were paid. And what I found difficult was that Bob Seaton, Frank Butterworth, one other, the officers, they were the ones who had to apologise. They had to apologise in the Express, the Advertiser, I think the Manchester Evening News, and that was something that we could well have done without. But the thing was, it was true. And the sequel to this is that Brown was actually thrown out of the council when he was drunk, because he kept shouting across the chamber, council chamber, to Harold Hope, who was a member of Portwood, you are the councillor for Moscow. And he kept and the mayor tried to get him out, he wouldn't go. Now, I don't know whether the police were brought in to shift him, or whether it was just the attendants, but he was thrown out, and I don't think he stood any chance of being re-elected. And he finished up, it was a sad thing, he finished up on his own, a lonely man, in Sussex Road in Edgeley Ward. And he was a beaten man, and he deserved all he got. Right, now, right, I want to talk now about Joe Wyatt, his man you've never heard of, but he did exist, and it's about Joe Wyatt and his lavatory. It was in the 40s, and Bob Hayes and I with him, we were canvassing down in Bringsway, and if you can imagine Chestergate, as it used to be, behind it was an area, a large area with houses all round, in which there were water closets in groups of 4 scattered around, and these were shared. Each water closet was shared between several families. This is what living was like in those days, and young people can't understand that this occurred. And when we went in paint on one of the doors was "Flush by order Joe Wyatt" in paint. And Bob said, "Oh, get Alan down, Alan Mason." And he came down and took a photograph of it. And then, and it was almost a stroke of genius, he went down into Bridgefield Street. Now, Bridgefield Street was parallel with Princess Street. It's now covered by car parks and the like. And it looked as though the houses there, slums as they were then, had been something special when they were built. The entrance to their yard with all the toilets in had a semi-elliptical arch over it, a Grecian arch.
Yeah.
And he got a photograph of this, and then the election address went out with the entrance, and then there's a photograph of the entrance at Bridgefield Street to a Tory borough with Joe White at the bottom, and people could make what they like of that. Whether it was Joe, whether it was his lavatory, his toilet, or most people would have thought it was. Stockport is a something house, and that was the message. So really, never happened since. I'd like now to tell you when Brian Slacker, who he became an agent eventually, joined the Labour Party. And it was in 1952 when we were doing work on the Adelphi, and I was working building a new office for Alf Lomas, who was the agent then. And there was a glass, it had been a dance hall before we took it over, and there was this glass window where it could be opened, where I think they used to take the money from them. And this knock came on, and I opened it, and there's a schoolboy stood there with a schoolboy's cap on, glasses, a blue gabardine coat with a belt, and he stammered badly, and he wanted to join the Labour Party. And I said, "What is your name?" He said, "Brian Slack." I said, "Which school do you go to?" He said, "Hot Hollywood." Well, that was the school I went to. And Jim Tucker was one of his teachers there, and he lived in Gradwell Street. And I said, "Well, what I'll do, I'll get the secretary from St Mary's Ward, in which Gradwell Street was in, and he'll come and he'll sign you up and tell you what you can do and this, that and the other." Now that was a boy, and he became a force to be reckoned with. People would complain that I was responsible for getting him in. Others would say, "Well done, Geoff," but others said, "No, you were not. We'd have been better off without him." So that's Brian Slack. There's a lot more about Brian later on. It's got to be. He couldn't be ignored. Now, the 1964 election, it involved a dust-up with the Chief Constable. And what happened was that Harold Wilson came, and we had the bear pit, and all I remember of Harold Wilson's speech there was that everywhere he went, he said, "I'm being asked by our supporters, send us a front bencher, send us Quinton Hogg." Now, Quinton Hogg eventually became Lord Aylsham, and he was being followed around everywhere, because when people stuck a banner up with Harold Wilson on him, he had a stick, and he kept belting the stick. So this was part of it. There were good times, elections, and they were different. And we had George Brown there, and the only thing I remember about George Brown, he was in the bear pit, was that he said, "I'm glad to be in Stockton." That's when he'll say, "You're in Stockport." And he could get away with it. Now then, Alec Douglas Hume, who was a Prime Minister, he came, but he came after our two. And clearly the police were frightened of putting him in the bear pit unless stuff was lobbed at him from the top. I can only recall seeing two policemen when our lads were there. And they cordoned off part of Mersey Square. And their meeting got underway, and there were quite a lot of youngsters there from schools. And this was being televised. And an incident occurred in which the wife of a Tory councillor, Billy Malpas, I knew him, his wife had laid into a lad in front of her with an umbrella, and it was on television, her belting this lad. And the police moved in, but instead of shifting her, they got hold of all the kids and threw them out. And what the police were doing, they were really being stewards. And she should have been the one who was taken out and probably charged, but no. Sometime later that day, someone threw a brick through the Mansion House window in High Street. That was the headquarters of the Tory party. And the following day, the Alf Lomas and Arnold Gregory and Maurice Ober went to see the Chief Constable. And it starts off, and apparently Orbach, this was Morris being Morris, he said, have you seen the television last night? And he said, "Your police are the laughing stock of Stockport." And the Chief Constable apparently said, "I thought I was going to be dealing with with gentlemen. I'm going to bring someone in." And his deputy came in, and things cooled down a bit, but everybody, he said he was going to be fair, but they were not. The first thing that went wrong is, police turned out and booked every car outside the Adelphi for parking, and there was no parking history. They booked every car they could find that looked as though it was at the Adelphi. And then on the Friday, and this is the Friday before the election day, Maurice Orbach was on a soapbox at the point, the Hippodrome was still there, a theatre on St Peter's Gate, and it was facing High Street and crossed over by St Peter's Gate going into the market. Maurice was there with a hallowed hailer, and people were going into the market, some were stopping to listen. It was Friday. And someone saw Hulbert, Tory MP, come out of the headquarters, Mansion House, and loot, and then go back. And then the police appeared, and they said, "You must go away, you must stop." And Maurice Orbach says, "What law have I broken?" And they couldn't answer that. He said, "I'm not breaking the law, I'm not stopping." And they said, "Well, you've got to go." And he said, "No." And by this time, the advertiser press was out from just across the road. Photographers were there, people were there gathering. And it finishes up with Maurice saying, "Right, arrest me, put the cuffs on me, arrest me." And the police didn't know what the hell to do, because they'd gone there and they'd no reason to be there.
Yeah.
And of course, this hit the headlines, and this was how the police were reacting to Labour. Now then, on the following Tuesday, I called in at the Adelphi to talk to Alf Lomas, and he said, "I'm going to ring the Chief Constable. We're fed up with, the way he's treating us." And he rang up and they said, Oh, he's unavailable, he's not in, you can't speak to him. So Alf said, and I remember his words exactly, right, put me through to whoever is holding the fort in his absence. And the fellow who came on was the Deputy Chief Constable, and our lot got on well with him apparently. And he said, "Hi Alf," and he told him, he said, he's in the next office to me, I've just been talking to him, I'll put you through. So Alf got on, and what Alf said to him, "I must tell you that by weekend there'll be a new government, there will be a new Home Secretary, and we are going to make a complaint to him concerning your behaviour in the way in which you've reacted to Labour in this election." And he said, and in reply he said, "I'm telling you straight, if anyone else from the Labour Party complains, it'll be all the worse for them." And I said, "Are you threatening us?" And he repeated it. And I said, "It was a pity you'd not had, you could buy them then, go onto a phone and record it." And this is the sort of fellow we were dealing with.
Yeah.
And we won the election. We made a complaint to Soskis, who was the Home Secretary, and they did nothing about it. They didn't want to argue with the police. And this man was blatantly, he blatantly a Tory.
Yeah.
Now then.
Okay.
Okay. Right, I want to talk about Fred Ollier, who became a lollipop man. It was not a case of him not making enough money out of being a solicitor and had to take up this as an extra job. It was in fact a political, if you like, a stunt. It was 1964 and the police constable Massey was behaving badly to the Labour Party. It was near the election. And he moved a crossing patrol from Edgeley Road, where it crosses from St Lesmer Road to Heath Bank. And we found the lady who should have been on, and she let us have the lollipop. And Fred, who was a municipal candidate, actually did the job as a lollipop man, stopping the traffic for children to cross at lunchtime on that day. We tipped the press off, they were there taking photographs, and of course as soon as they'd taken the photograph and got onto the police station to Massey, he put the lollipop woman back on that day. So it shows direct action can be effective. So Fred, of course, was doing a good job, and it might have been something he'd have turned his hand to if things fell apart in his practice. Right, I want now to turn to the Adelphi. While it was empty, there were a lot of development discussions that went on, and I don't intend to deal with all of them, except to say that there was one which was really significant in so much as four of us. There was myself, Fred Ollier, John Doughty, and I'm not sure of the others, it might have been Brian Slack. We had to go to London to meet a property developer, and Maurice Auerbach was there, and there was an officer from Transport House. Transport House was the Labour Party headquarters in those days, and his job was to look after our interests from our development. We're used to them trying this on, but he was there and he was useful. And I was told by Maurice that I had to make clear to Mr Miller that Harold, who was a North West MP, was rather interested in what was going on in Stockport, and he has in fact given us an undertaking that when it is built he will open it for us. And I did that, and Mr Miller was interested, and it was all this talking about this and that, and then the lad from Transport House said, Seaford owes us one. And Eric Miller said, right, I'll talk to Seaford tomorrow. Now Seaford was one of the top architects of his day, and his building, the Centre Point, was remarkable because it was very high on a very small area. And we went home, nothing happened, and then about 7 or 8 weeks later, the planning department at the town hall got in touch with us to say, this is fantastic. This building, when it goes up, will be the best building in Stockport. 20 stories on a very small site. It was Centre Point Mark II, really. And the next thing went on, I think Miller must have been his outfit. It was Seafords in Manchester who'd done it. We didn't know. They'd been up, measured the site, got out the drawings and worked them in. We didn't know that, but we were told there would be no doubt that it would be accepted, providing other conditions could be met. And that was, the site had to be bought. The shop next door to the Adelphi, he was glad to sell. I won't tell you what he sold, but he was glad to sell. And then the building on the corner, they agreed to sell. But it was a shop where the Theatre Royal had been. There was a music hall theatre there. And the shop was in the ground floor, and they refused to sell. And because they refused to sell, that killed the development off. And they accepted, and it must have been Miller's outfit who, the developer, whether they'd not offered enough or whatever, they refused to sell and the whole deal fell through. Now then, when we were in London, we got to know Mr. Miller, and he came into the news when Harold Wilson resigned because of ill health. I think it was 1956. He could, as members of Prime Ministers can do, they have an award list that can make people lords or this and the
Dissolution
other. And
honours.
Eric Miller was knighted. And it was on the grounds that when Labour had been in opposition, he and some other supporters had financed an office for Harold Wilson when he was leader of the opposition, because they had no accommodation for him to use, and that was the reason given for his knighthood. Now then, sadly, later it became news he'd been charged with bribing a policeman to give him information from the police computer about business opponents who he was dealing with. And before he could go on trial, he went into his back garden and shot himself. And it was an unusual end. But that was Mr. Miller, and we didn't get our new Adelphi there. There were several dues went through. The last one, there was one where we were being dealt with. We got an architect from London, in fact, made drawings of what we were going to have. And the man we were dealing with suddenly disappeared. And it turned out to be that he was part of the Poulson outfit in North Yorkshire, which led to him, Mr. Poulson, an architect, and T. Dan Smith, who was a leader of the Newcastle City Council, and John Cunningham, who was a Labour frontbencher. His father, Andrew Cunningham, who was a councillor up there, he was sent to prison, and we didn't get anything from that either. And the last one, where the building went up, and we were supposed to be having the first floor, that fell through because he couldn't sell the building unless they had sold all of it. And what they gave us in return, they bought some premises for us on Buxton Road, which were investment premises. We got 6,000 a year from them. And then we sold that, and with the proceeds of that and all the money that we had, we bought the club. And that's how the club came to be in existence. And I'd just like to pay tribute to Tom Grundy, because the club went heavily into the holdings funds for some years, and it was Tom Grundy who got it onto a level footing where it looked after itself and paid for itself. And I wish him all the luck in these difficult times that lie ahead, and we'll give any help as a holdings company that we can. So the Bingo Bandits, it's rather personal. Edgeley Ward and Heaton Lane Ward joined forces to run a bingo night at the Edgeley Labour Club in Hardcastle Road. And the club, they ran one on Friday night, we did it on Wednesday. And it was very good, we made money. And it meant we could do a lot of things in those wards. Eventually we brought in Shaw Heath with us, and I became a bingo caller. He had to be. Bernard Greaves became a bingo caller. I can remember now, whenever he made a mistake, which was frequent, and they started moaning and shouting, he was saying, it was a my word this, all right, I'm just testing your observances. Every time I say that, Barrett laughs about Bernard. And the outcome was that I'm stood by the bar as waiting to read off people who claim they got a line, when the door opened and two fellas, plain clothes, who obviously policemen, followed by 10 coppers in uniform and hats on, rolled in. And this is at the time of God's Anderton, who was considered to be God's
representative
chief constable
for
on
the
earth.
GMP, yes.
And he was having a go at bingo and all the rest of it. Now then, it stopped, obviously. And the policemen went round demanding that the books of bingo that had not been used were handed in. And I heard one man say, no, you're not having them, they're mine, I paid for them, and he wouldn't give them to me, and they left him. There was a man there from the gaming board, an officer, and he was very helpful, because we had money which we had to pass on to somebody, we couldn't take it away, and he gave me advice on how we should do that. Couldn't give it to we couldn't run the game, it had finished, but we went to the people who had one, and it was distributed amongst those people, and they had a good night. Now then, the detective sergeant, plain clothes, who was running this, had us in a committee room, the committee room at the club, and he kicked off by saying, why has somebody not asked for this? And he said, it's a search warrant. Somebody should have asked for it. And I said, I think this should tell you something about the people who you're talking to. We're not criminals. We're not aware of these events where search warrants are required, and we're able to respond to it. And then he said to the treasurer of the club, I came in here 2 weeks ago and advised you to change it, and you've not done, and that's why you're in trouble. And they'd not told us.
Really?
Now the outcome was that we were charged, 3 of us were charged with running a bingo where the members were not in a bingo club. And really, legally, you can only have what they pay to come in as members. And all the money you make from the bingo has got to be paid back. The club were done for serving alcohol to people who were not members of the club. And we all finished up at number 1 court in Stockport there. And I know that while we were talking, there were 4 there, 4 officers from the club, and there were 3 of us from the branch who were running it. And we were talking there, and the president or the chairman of the club was a man in his 70s, and he said, I've been in this courtroom before. Everybody said, well, what have you been up to? And he said, it was when I was a boy, and I was given a medal. I jumped in the river to save a young boy who was drowning, and he'd been given a medal. And Fred Ollie said, oh, I'll use that. You know, that will tell them something about you. Now, that meant there were 7 of us, and there was no room in the dock for 7 people. So we all had to stand in front of the dock. And they were done. It was up and down job with the club. They'd done it. In our case, the prosecution accepted that it had been an honest way in which we did business. And we realised that there had been 2 people there for about 3 weeks, a man and a woman, who were in fact in from the police because they turned up on the night of the raid. We were found guilty and convicted, and we had a conditional discharge, and you know, I felt humiliated by being in a position where I'd been convicted. And I don't know anyone else in the Labour Party who's been convicted. There's only John Broome, and that was a trade union job. He'd been convicted for some trouble on a road where there was some strike action. And I know, I think it was about £20 that we had to pay, and I offered to pay it for each individual. And they said, oh no, you can't do it like that. It will be sent to you and this, and you'll have to pay it in this way. And for me, the situation had a further implication. I was required to visit the Director of Education, who was a teacher, and I knew him well and he knew me well, and he said, I'm sorry, Geoff, but this is something that I just have to do, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, no problem. But that was another humiliation that it caused me. And I've never been in the club since.
Well, it's not a Labour club now, is it?
I don't know what it is.
No.
I may have been in because I carved a plaque for Elizabeth Little, whose husband and her were members of that club. In fact, her husband was remarkable. He was a railway man, and in 1947 he was a driver of a train that got into the slow line on the viaduct and stopped to allow the speed train to go right through. When the speed train got onto his line and ran into the back of his train, and the wooden coaches, and 7 people were killed. And he said that even though it was this train that was run into, he felt guilty that had happened. And this was years afterwards. Fred Little and Elizabeth Little, she became a deputy mayor, and Martha White Wither, who was another councillor, became the mayor. It's the first time we'd had a woman mayor and a deputy mayor. And that was, you know, the bandits. We made a lot of money and we didn't do it again. I think the club went on, and they did the Wednesday night as well.
Yeah.
So there we are. So that's the Bingo Bandits. Geoff Spencer, Wally Rowbottom, he was the other one, and the Bernard Greaves. Both those men are now dead. Long time ago. And Wally Rowbottom got immaculate books. So much so that even though we did take a few bob that we shouldn't do, it was done in such a way that they were satisfied that we were an honest bunch of people who had fallen on bad times. So that's the Bingo Bandits. I'd now like to move on to Barbara Castle when she spoke at a meeting during the '64 election at the town hall. And I was the chairman for the meeting, and in the afternoon I was took a call at school from the producer who was from BBC, asking could he have permission to put television in. Said okay, and he said, call in on your way home and I'll talk to you about where you need people seated. Called in and he said, this is where the camera's going to be, we should be panning it there, so get most of your people in those seats in the town hall. The meeting opens, and within minutes somebody runs onto the platform and showers the platform party in leaflets. And Bob Hayes gets up, chases this fella and corners him in a toilet. And he was just going to thump him or something like that. He was often ready to thump, was Bob. He felt sorry for him, and he was a young fellow who was clearly mentally retarded. And he was being used by the fascists who were there. We didn't know it was that at the time. The councillors spoke, and there were two there, one from Cheadle.
Just far away.
Right, I'll go back then. With four candidates there. There was Maurice Orbach, Arnold Gregory, Stockport North, Stockport South, the candidate from Hazel Grove and the candidate from Cheadle, and they spoke, and then Barbara arrived and she spoke. She seemed a bit perturbed when I mentioned in introducing her that she had in fact passed a bill when she was Minister of Transport that meant a lot of people who might have been killed no longer were. It was a thing called drink driving, the breath test for it. And she moaned I could say no, but it was too late, had done it. Now she got up, it was Barbara, she was good. She spoke for about 15 minutes, no more, and then she was whisked off to a meeting elsewhere. I then announced we would take questions, written questions, and the stewards were collecting them in, and up they came. Maurice had started speaking just to fill in the time, and I started dishing the questions out. The first one was on immigration, and Maurice took that. There was one, I don't know what it was, but I gave it to Arnold, and Arnold didn't want really to do it. I think what he wanted, Arnold, was questions. His big interest in Parliament had been in trade with the rest of the world, and he travelled a lot. But eventually I had to say to him, look, Arnold, I've not been an MP for 6 years, and I can answer some of these questions, so get on with this and answer this one. The Hazel Grove lad and the Cheadle lad were taking the questions again, then they answered it. And during these questions, a man down on the left-hand side, fairly near to the front, jumped up and shouted, "Why will you not answer my question?" And Ernie Bruner, the reporter from the Express, who was a European Jew whose family had been killed in the Holocaust, he jumped onto the press table at the front of where I was sat and said, "Geoff, this is Hesketh, who was a leader of the fascist movement in Manchester." And simultaneously about 5 others jumped up all round, and they were all shouting, "Answer this question." And he not put a question in. The stewards then decided, the police who were in the foyer at the back, they'd said to John Doherty, who was the chief steward, "Do you want us to move them?" And he said, "No, we'll shift them." And Hesketh was there spouting it off, and I know that someone 2 rows in front of him stood up and gave him the Nazi salute. And eventually he was turfed out by a steward that we had, who was a chef at Stockport College. He was about 15 stone in weight, and he went without arguing. and they were cleared. Now, I think we were set up by the BBC because I think they knew that they probably thought the television cameras would cover everything. May have done, I don't know, but it wasn't on television. Barbara was. So that was an experience I think we could have done without. The fascists, I don't know what they called themselves then, whether the National Front or not, but they turned up with an intention of discrediting the Labour Party and also destroying a meeting, but it didn't succeed. The next thing I'd like to mention is it concerns me personally, and it was when, a bit of bragging here really, when I had talks with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Not everyone who can have talks with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but it was in London, and in those days you could walk into Downing Street and through it. Nobody stopped you. There was no railings there or police there. You could walk through. And I walked down the steps at the end into, and beyond that was Green Park. And as I walked down there, Hugh Dalton, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's just walking towards me. He'd been in the Foreign Office. And I asked him to sign my Labour Party card for 1947, which he did on the back. And also on there is a signature from Ernest Bevan, and from a later time, Tony Blair. And when I got his autograph, he started to talk. He wanted to know about Stockport, what was going on in the League of Youth there. And he started telling me about Parliament and what was going on there. He told me what he thought about Churchill. I'll not repeat it, because I think any Tories watching this would be very upset. And eventually he said to me, "When are you going home?" I said, "I'm going home tonight." And he said, "Listen to the 9 o'clock news for the next 2 or 3 nights." When I got home, I said to my mum, "Is anything being on about the Chancellor?" "Oh no." I stayed in the night afterwards, which was Tuesday, and nothing on about the Chancellor. I went to a meeting of the Labour League of Youth on the Wednesday. When I got in, it had been on. And he'd actually flown for an emergency meeting in New York about some problem or other, that whether it was affecting us or not. But I thought after it, and I'd been a journalist, I could have put 2 and 2 together and picked the story up. Now then, later, 6 months or so later, Hugh was walking into Parliament to give his budget, and on his way in, he was met by a journalist who he knew well, trusted, and he asked him, "What's in it, Hugh? What's in?" And he told him all the main details of what was in his budget, and he said that "You'll not let them be printed before I sat down." No. The journalist, it's the Evening Standard, the paper, he rang the editor, he gave him the details of the budget, and he promised him that he wouldn't have it on the streets, but he broke his promise. This is editors at work. And while Dalton was speaking, it was being read on the streets of London in the Evening Standard. And of course, someone came into the House of Commons and drew his attention to the fact that his budget was already being published. He was sacked by Clem Attlee the next day. He did at some time in the future recover, but he was replaced by Stafford Cripps as the Chancellor, who was a very dominant figure. So that was me holding discussions with the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1947. So it's not bad. I was 21, and it just shows it wouldn't happen now for all the security, you would not be allowed to be there. And I got Ernie Bevan, he came out as I was just leaving Dalton, and he said, "Good luck, lad," and that's all I get out of him. I know one of his drivers had been waiting for him, shouted at me when Dalton had gone and said, "You'll still have to pay your tax." And there it is, that's the card, that's what they used to be like, and proud of it. The next one I want to deal with is Brian Slack. There could be stories galore about this fella. He himself was a plotter with extreme. He couldn't be trusted. He had a great brain. He was very intelligent. He'd attended the course that Prescott went on.
At Ruskin.
At Ruskin, and then backed out of it. He was very, very smart, but my assessment of him ultimately was he was indolent. He couldn't really stick at things. But he became the leader of the Labour group at one stage. But at that time, there's a lot of plotting going on. It was endemic. You know, deciding who was going to be voted for at the AGM and things like that. There was a lot of manoeuvring, votes being harnessed and going to this candidate, that candidate. And the pub where it could be said was the social drinking place for the Labour Party was the Nelson. I don't drink, so I don't drink excessively, I don't go in pubs. And he went in and did Brian for his pint, and the landlord said, "Come with me, Brian, and bring your pint with you." And he took him into the cellar, and he said, "Now then, put your pint on that barrel there, and I'll keep bringing your pints down during the evening." He said, "Now sit on that barrel there and put your ear up against that pipe." And he could hear everything that the plotters upstairs were deciding who was going to be voted for, who was going to be sacked. That was one was going to be sacked, and there was got elected. So that's one that nobody knows about. But in many ways, there was this sometimes hostility towards each other, but there was a lot of members. We had a lot of members who were active, and you know, we've moved through times with the Labour government where our membership has fallen away. At the moment, even though the Tories are back, we're not overburdened with members who do the work. So I'd like to move on now to Lucky Stockport. Now, there was a programme on television called That Was the Week That Was. And it was a satirical programme, and it was a Tory government, and they took some pasting. And one of the acts that they did, they started looking at MPs who, since they'd been elected at the last election, had not spoken in Parliament. There was something like 3 years, and they never opened their mouth. And it came on, and first of all, it's Sir Arnold Gridley, Stockport, and he'd not done it. And then, Lucky Stockport, Sir Norman Hulbert, MP, Stockport North, he's not spoke either. And Lucky Stockport was used by us to crucify them. One of the things that Alf Lummis was the agent, one of the things these two got up to when they were at the War Memorial for November 11th, they always attended in morning suits and tall hats. And we got a picture of the two together with the tall hats. And we ran it on, we used to do papers, 4 sheets, like the size of a Daily Mirror, something like that. And that was the front page, and it showed these two. I suppose today would have called them, you know, toffee Tories, things like that. And only they just said, "Lucky Stockport." Everybody knew what it meant. And then, of course, we went on to win the election. We did we also used it on the back of an election dress. So that was that. Now, the man who wrote that was Gerald Kaufman, who later became an MP, and is still an MP. He must be one of the longest serving MPs in the Commons. And Gerald Kaufman has he's visited Stockport on many times, and I know he was sat down at a table and there were some members there, and I sat down and I said, "Lucky Stockport," and no one round the table had a clue what we were talking about. And he started laughing and said, "Yes, lucky Stockport." And he told me about things, how things were organised there. So, lucky Stockport, we got them out eventually. Now, I'd like to refer now to Harold Wilson. He's in fact, a lot of people speak badly of him. Some of the intellectuals around, and I don't think he deserved that. He was
an intellectual if anybody was. He was an intellectual if anybody was. He was an FRS.
Yes, he was. But nevertheless, he was a man of the people. He smoked his pipe. And, I mean, this is interesting, I think, that in the North East, nowhere else in Britain, I don't know which election it would be, but they did a poster, and all it had on was a pipe with smoke coming out of it. And at that time, there was an advert on television for Milk Stout, Worthington's Milk Stout. And there was this fellow, he was a classical actor. He sat at a table with the Milk Stout in a glass in front of him, and he says, "It looks good." Then he picks it up, has it, puts it down and says, "It tastes good, and by golly, it does you good." And the poster that went up in Newcastle was this pipe, and underneath, "By golly, he does you good." And there was a fellow from The Guardian reporting up there, a man who died prematurely, and he said, "This is the sign of a folk hero." And that was Harold. When the '64 election result was being declared, he was in his hotel in Liverpool, waiting for his own result. And he said when the Stockport result went through, "Right, we've won." And had we not won the 2 Stockport seats, they would not have won. That's how tight it was. And of course, they had another election in '66 shortly afterwards, where we did win. I saw him speaking in the House of Commons, and it was the most remarkable speech I've heard. It was the day that Ted Heath had been made leader, so he was not there. And this was a master of his craft. And I know that on the train back, I was with some of the MPs, and Connie Ziliakis from Gorton said, "That's the best speech I've ever heard in the House of Commons." And the next day, in the Manchester Evening News, you had a cartoon, and it was in a Western saloon, a cowboy's place, and there's Wilson with 2 guns, and there are bodies all over the show, some hanging over the bar, legs up, and it had underneath the sharpest gun in the West, and then in brackets Minster, the sharpest gun or the hottest gun in the West. That was the message. And this fellow was good, and he'd been to Stockport before he was Prime Minister, but it's worth recognising that this fella had it and he won elections. Now this one, I'm not bragging with this because it's not something I really should be proud of. But before the '64 election, we were required, the chairman and the candidate of each constituency, that's north and south, and Alf Lomas, the agent, we had to go to a meeting at Transport House. And Archie Whitesmith was the chairman of the South, and we went down there. And there was a lot of speeches there, but at the end, they were having a snack, and they'd laid out a great deal of material that you could buy for use in the general election. And I was looking at these, and they were a remarkable thing. They were made out of metal, and they were square, and a front on, and they were lit up inside, and you could have figures stuck on so that it was, let's go with Labour, we'll get things done. And I'm looking at these, and this fellow in a suit stood next to me, and he said, "Oh, these are good." I said, "Well, we'll not be able to afford this, they're dear, but I can make those out of wood." And he said, "Well, we'll not be, we'll be buying them, and I think we'll put an order in now." And I said, "Are you a candidate?" He said, "Yes, I'm the candidate for Buckingham." When I got back to the table, Alf Lomas said to me, "That fellow you've been talking to is a millionaire." He became an MP, and I think he was chairman of some committee that looked after the way MPs were treated in the House, the canteen and things like that. He later bought the Daily Mirror. He was a remarkable man. He came to Britain as from Czechoslovakia just before the war, and he spoke Czech as a Czechoslovakian. He had other languages, and he spoke English. And he made his way, became a captain. That's why they called him Captain Bob. And of course, the poor lad, he came unstuck. He overstretched himself. When I spoke to him, he was in fact, he had a publishing firm, publishing books, and some were excellent books. We had some in school.
Pergamon Press.
Yeah, Pergamon Press, that was it. And when he took the Mirror on, of course, he became big, and he became something of a despot. And he came unstuck when he borrowed, I think he only borrowed the money from the pension funds of the newspapers he had to keep the business afloat. But ultimately, he was not able to pay it back. And of course, he finished up in the Adriatic from his very expensive yacht. And there was questions, did he jump, or was he pushed, or was he thrown? But at least he finished up, and his body was recovered, and he was buried the next day in Jerusalem. So Captain Bob, I met, and I followed his progress.
One of the more colourful ones, Bob Maxwell.
Yes. I followed his progress from that session there. Oh no, by the way, I went on to make 7 of these cases for putting in windows for the shops. And one was a big one for the AU office on Wellington Road. We tended to put them where there were buses passing, and there were 7. There was one on Disbury Road, forget where the others were, and we used them again in 1966. And then, I don't know where they went, I was told they were under the stage at the Adelphi. So when they knocked it down, they probably all smashed the smithereens. Nothing lasts long anyway, because it becomes all that. But I made them out of wood, and they worked. So that was meeting Captain Bob. Right. The next one is about Bob Hayes and the Black Maria. Now, Bob Hayes, you've heard him mention me. And Bob Hayes was one of the first people I met when I joined the Labour Party. This was before I joined the League of Youth in Hollywood Ward. Bob and Margaret Hayes. Bob was the chairman of the branch, Hollywood, and Margaret was the secretary. and he was one of the few people in Stockport who had a car, and he had a Mercedes. He was in the business of body repairs, but he never had a car. They're always motors. And this one, I don't know how true it is, but he reckoned that the first name in the logbook of the car was that of Eric von Ribbentrop, who was the ambassador to Britain. He was the ambassador to Britain, who, when he visited Manchester, he gets out of his car, goes and Alderman Joe Toole is the Lord Mayor, and as Ribbentrop gets the bottom steps, he gives him the nicest salute, and Joe Toole grabs his hand and says, "Nay, lad, this is how we do it here," and shook his hand. Now, Joe Toole is related to one of our councillors, one of our very good councillors, who's been around as a councillor for some time. And that, of course, is Colin.
Yes.
Yeah. And he is one of the prime movers of bringing the party into the 20th century. I'm still in the last century. It gets over my head. Anyway, the Black Maria, we went down into Gauzy Bank, chasing some voters up. And down at the bottom, there's a bridge over the Mersey there, to the sidings. And there was a Black Maria there. So we stopped the Mercedes, and Bob gets out, and he knew the sergeant who was there, and he said, "What the hell is this?" And I said, "Oh, well, they're coming across now. They've been arrested, there's 5 women. They've been pinching coal." And as they come over, this copper's with them, and Bob says to them, "Have you voted?" And they said, "No, we haven't." So he says to the sergeant, "Now look, you can do this. Come on, do me a favour. Stop at the top of the road and let them get out and vote at the school, St John's. Then they can get back and you take..." He said, "I can't do that." Bob said, "Of course you can." "Oh no, I daren't do that, Bob." And then Bob said to them, he said, "What time will they be back?" And the police sergeant said, "Well, I can tell you this, Bob. The husbands will be cooking their own tea tonight." Now, you know, the Black Maria, you don't have them now. I don't know what they put them in, but they used to be in the Black Maria. So that was Bob. Have you voted? And we got in anyway. I want now to refer to the Liberals, who deserve all the rubbish you can throw at them, really. Bear in mind, we've got a minister in there, a Liberal government now, who's wielding the axe over the public services. But this was the 1964 election, and it was conceived that if a Liberal candidate could stand with us, they would take votes from the Tories. And in Stockport, we got a Liberal candidate standing in the north, but not in the south. Maurice Orbach in the south didn't have a Liberal. And the outcome turned out to be that a businessman in London who had attended Stockport School had heard or learned of the problems that the Liberals had in finding a deposit and a bob or two for a leaflet. And he made a donation. And of course, no one asked questions about who he was, why he'd done it. The Liberals accepted it and put up a candidate. Job done. And some people were asking, how did this fella know? Well, Maurice Orbach lived in London. Now, need I say more? Not really, I shouldn't. But I know where the money came from. And we won the election So it was money well spent. Morris was a pro. Burned out of his fingers. He once gave me some good advice. I developed careers education in Stockport schools, and Davey, the director, rang me up one day and said, "You won't be having school me next Wednesday, but you come in with me to I think it was where the Masons meet on Wellington Road, Masonic Guildhall, and you'll be having a much better meal there. You're booked in." I said, and he said, "You're going to tell the business leaders in Stockport, there'll be about 40 or 50 there, of what they can do to help the youngsters in school in a way that enables the careers work that's being done in every school to develop fully. And you're the fella to do it." And I said, "Well, you know, working in the place like this where all the Masons go, it's not my scene." He said, "It doesn't matter, you're going." So at the weekend I was talking to Morris, and I told him, I said, I'm not at all happy." He said, "Well, I'll give you some advice." He said, "When you get up and stand up, you must tell